Kindly note that the views and opinions shared in this video are those of the speaker and do not constitute advice given by Classic Private Wealth. Any advice given by Classic Private Wealth will be in writing in the form of a wealth management proposal. Classic Private Wealth is an authorized financial services provider.
So I'll kick off with what we know about the coronavirus. And obviously, a lot of what I have to say now has become kind of very general knowledge. 4 weeks ago, fewer people were fully on top of what's happening with the virus. Most people have now had time to sit at home and think about the virus for a while. So the first thing that we have to say about the virus is that it's something that is airborne and spreads through the lungs and the respiratory system. So it kind of spreads quite easily because if you have something that spreads through blood, for instance, it's difficult for that to spread. It's spreading is slow. If you have something that spreads through the respiratory system, it typically spreads quite quickly. So things like colds and flus, quite common. And then the other thing is that it's extremely contagious. Now, the extreme contagiousness has to do with the idea that people can actually be infected with the virus and be contagious, but not know that they're ill. So it may well be, we're not quite sure yet, that some people actually never present with symptoms. That there's a lot of people who get the virus and it never presents with symptoms, but actually become contagious and spread the virus. And this may be especially true of young people and children. But apart from that, there's also a long incubation period, meaning it takes up to 2 weeks from contracting the virus to the point where you present with symptoms. And in that period, you are contagious. So what happens is it's very difficult to contain the spread of the virus just because it's asymptomatic for so long. And people don't know that they're ill, so they go around and they spread the virus and they're not aware of it. So typically what happens is that if you don't have very specific measures against the virus, every person contracting it gives it to roughly 3 other people. Now, if you look at epidemiology, if you are spreading it to more than one person, if each person who contracts it spread to more than one person, the virus goes viral, it grows exponentially. Whereas if you can contain it to less than one, it basically eventually dies. It stops spreading and it dies. So extremely contagious, spreads extremely quickly in the normal population if you don't do anything about it. So that's the first point, is that it's actually at least as contagious as normal flu and colds. And if you look at normal flu, it typically spreads to about 70% of the population, a new strain of flu. So what we would say is that apparently, because of the fact that there's no resistance in the general population, something like coronavirus might spread to 80% of the population if you don't contain it. So we have to say that if we do nothing, the virus will probably spread to 60 to 80% of the population over probably 2 flu seasons, if you like. So over about a 2-year period, somewhere between 60 and 80% of the population will contract it. And then the next question is, how deadly is it? Meaning, what is the mortality rate? How many people are likely to die from this? And this is really where the difficult part comes in. We don't really know what the mortality is because we have very little experience of it. There's been very little generalized testing around the world, so difficult to tell. But we have some examples from the early stages. So if we can go to the mortality graph, this is not really updated, but we don't really have much helpful new information that contradicts this. The information we have actually comes first. please. Let me just get the correct graph on. You should be seeing a graph with little bubbles, small on the left-hand side, growing bigger towards the right-hand side, and you don't need to try to see all of those little numbers in it.
I can see it.
The one, pardon? Do you see? Does everybody see the
Yes,
graph?
I can see it.
Okay, excellent. So we're all seeing the little bubbles. What you see there is this is an illness that is much more deadly in older people. So interestingly enough, the last time we had a pandemic in 1918, it was a flu to which older people had some immunity. So actually it was a flu that killed young people. This actually definitely, the mortality is concentrated in older people. And one of the things that we see is that most people who die from it have some kind of underlying form of illness. And my general observation would be that as I move around among my older friends, most of them have some underlying illness of some sort. So it's not unusual for older people to have some sort of underlying illness. So that might be part of the issue. The other issue might just be age. So what you see is that if you were in Italy and you contracted the virus, roughly 20% of the people they know contracted the virus who are older than 80 died. So that's a huge percentage. 1/5 of people who contract the virus dies. If you look at the same thing for China, it's significantly lower, only about 15%, and in South Korea, only about 10%. So these things have got to do with smoking rates and all of those things as well. But what you can see is that as people grow older, the mortality goes very high. And this very high mortality rate is something that scares politicians very much, people who care about public health. And even though they don't really know what it is, they are cautious that it might be extremely high. And therefore, what they do is, because they know that it's extremely contagious and may kill a lot of people, that gives them an incentive to do something about it. And what we care about in our talk today is not really about right or wrong, but about what the reaction of policymakers will be and what the policymakers' reactions have been and how effective or not those reactions have been. So this high mortality rate, now again, if you just think about 80% of the population getting infected in South Africa, that means 40 million out of the 50 million people may eventually contract the virus. If you then have a mortality rate of 1% among those who contracted, that means 400,000 people dying, which is a very large number of people. If you're thinking about the United States, 300 million people, if you eventually have 250 million of those infected, if you then have 1% of those people dying, that is 2.5 million people dying. So a very, very large number of people is likely to die if we just leave the virus to spread. From an economic point of view, though, what you have to say is that those are older people who are no longer economically active and are typically people who are drawing pensions or some sort of government grant, etc. So the deaths are likely to be much more of a human tragedy than an economic disaster. Economically, it's something that you could cope with. So the first reaction that governments have to this situation then is to actually talk about flattening the curve. So if we can go to the next graph with the curves, you typically on TV will have seen these type of drawings. So what you see there is a dotted line that may not be so clear on your on your graphs, but there's a dotted line with the little healthcare system capacity written on it, so you can see where it lies roughly. And what they say is that if you leave the virus to spread, the healthcare system will be overwhelmed. So we've actually seen this in practice in China, in Italy, in New York. We've seen the healthcare systems come under very great strain. So what happens is that if you leave it, you actually end up with a lot of people that get ill and needs to be hospitalized or needs to go into intensive care or needs to have a ventilator, and you just don't have the capacity to treat them. So the incidental evidence we have is that in places where the healthcare system gets overwhelmed, you have double the mortality rate that you would have if the healthcare system is coping. So for instance, in Germany, the mortality rate is significantly lower than in Italy, but in Germany, the epidemic never got so bad that it overwhelmed the healthcare system. So I see there are still some problems. German doctors who are protesting against the lack of protective clothing are now going to work naked in order to emphasize the fact that they don't have the adequate protection. So even in a place like Germany, everything's not perfect. But so the idea is what you do is you do something to slow the epidemic and to flatten the curve so that it doesn't overwhelm your healthcare system, and you let it spread through the population, but at a slow enough rate that you can handle it from the point of view of the healthcare system. The problem with that is that actually these curves are drawn in a very a positive way. The actual curves look like the next graph. We can just go on to the next graph. There you see the projected curves under various scenarios, and the red little flat line there right at the bottom is the healthcare capacity. So what it says is that even in countries with the best possible healthcare systems, if you let the epidemic run through the population, it vastly exceeds your ability to cope with this. So in a place like Britain, you have slogans like "Save our NHS," because effectively the result of this is that the healthcare workers at the front line get absolutely overwhelmed. So they have to deal with choosing who will be treated and who will not be treated, essentially who will live and who will die, which is an extremely traumatic thing by itself to have to make that choice. They also work extremely long hours, and then a large number of them get infected. So it's perceived as extremely unfair on healthcare workers that they should be subjected to this kind of trauma. So if we look at those characteristics, we can go back to without the graph for a moment. If we look at what governments do in order to deal with the situation, there is one thing that governments can do that is effective against the virus, and that is a general lockdown of some sort, also called social distancing, because this thing spreads when people have contact with each other. Basically, you exhale or you cough or you sneeze, gets into the air, other people pick it up from surfaces or from the air, and eventually a lot of people get ill. So if you prevent people from coming into close contact with other people, the spread lessens dramatically. So what we've seen in many, many countries is that they go into some form of lockdown. Now, in China, where it first emerged, they put a whole province into a very, very stringent lockdown. And 2 months later, there's very, very few new incidences of the illness. So if you lock down very strictly for 2 months, you actually come to the point where new infections become very rare. Of course, when new infections stop, that doesn't stop the illness. The illness, the people are already ill, still go to hospital and die for a while, but then after a while you see the pressure on the hospitals starting to dissipate. So in Wuhan, in China, where it originated, we're now told that the hospitals are empty. We don't have hospitalized COVID-19 patients anymore. And then, so if you think about the virus, it then spread from China. And what happened is that a couple of the places close to China, places like Singapore and Taiwan, immediately started taking measures to contain the virus. So Singapore, for instance, went into quite a strict lockdown virtually immediately, and they prevented an epidemic from developing. So if you lock down early enough, you can prevent the epidemic from taking hold, because it's typically people who travel who bring it in. So if you close your borders and you prevent any travel, you can actually prevent this from taking hold in your local population. What happened is that the virus then spread to Europe. It seems to have the epicenter of the spread in Europe seems to have been the skiing lodges. So people went on skiing holidays. They mixed with other people who had the virus. That spread the virus across Europe. And then we basically have had epidemics in Italy, Germany. We're currently having one in Britain. And across the whole of Europe, essentially, has been affected. And what has happened in those countries is that some countries have locked down earlier and some countries have locked down later. But each one of those countries, when they start getting large numbers of infections and they start seeing the patients in their critical care or intensive care units, they all lock down, and the lockdown works. So after about 2 to 3 weeks of lockdown, the new infections start dissipating, and after about 2 months of lockdown, the new infections go to a very low level, and after about 3 months, you actually get hospital pressure starting to dissipate. So we've seen this pattern basically everywhere. So it's interesting to observe that the closer the government is to what we would call a populist government, meaning government by people who don't really care about what their policies are as long as they get elected, people like Boris Johnson, some people would say people like Donald Trump, those countries tend to be very slow to lock down, because lockdown is a very unpopular thing, at least when there is limited illness. In those countries which have rulers who are basically really care for their people and are focused on health, you get early lockdown. So one of the examples of early lockdown is New Zealand. New Zealand locked down early and strictly. So New Zealand really hasn't had an epidemic. And we'll come back to New Zealand when we talk about what's new. But in essence, you get lockdowns, quite strict lockdowns in most places in the world. So if you're thinking about it, at least half of the world's population at this point is living under some form of fairly strict lockdown. And we've now started seeing various things saying, levels of lockdown, etc. Initially, we just heard about lockdown. But actually, very few places have started to experiment with anything except a fairly hard lockdown, meaning you try to limit social interaction to as little as possible. So what we're seeing from governments is that the reaction to the virus, correct or not, is that they will eventually go into a fairly hard period of lockdown, and that lockdown will eventually bring the virus under control. So what it looks like is that after the lockdown, there seems to be a situation where, if you're thinking about New York, that's one of the places where they've now started doing testing for resistance or antibodies. It looks like about 20% of people in New York City has actually had the virus. So it spread fairly widely, but they limited to 20%, and that still overwhelmed their their health system, and eventually doesn't only overwhelm the health system, it also overwhelms the system that deals with bodies. So morgues, all of the whole infrastructure that deals with dead people come under great pressure because we're not geared to deal with that number of dead people at the same time. So only about, if you think about an epidemic that infects 80% of people, you would have had 4 times the ill people in New York. That would have been a real disaster. But because they eventually locked down, they limited the spread to about 20% of people. Those people that get it, roughly 20% of them have to go to hospital, and then roughly 5 of the 20 end up in intensive care, and about half of those have to go onto ventilators. And if you eventually go onto a ventilator, it's actually quite likely that you'll die. Not many people actually survive once they go onto ventilators. So about 60% of people who get put on ventilators eventually die anyway. But that means it really puts massive pressure on your intensive care facilities. And one of the problems is we have no medicines that actually work against this that we know of. So there's a lot of experiments going on, but we haven't found anything that's effective. So in essence, what they can do for you is take care of you, give you oxygen because it affects your lungs. So what people mostly die of is they die of a lung disease. So there's lots of other symptoms, muscle pain, etc., etc. What people die of is lack of oxygen. So in hospitals, the first thing that they do is to give you more oxygen, and eventually they help you to breathe through a ventilator, and they oxygenate your body. And part of what they monitor is the oxygen level in your body. Now, the point, of course, so I'll go on to the fourth part, or the third part, which is really the part about the economy. What we're seeing now is if you go into this hard form of lockdown, you typically have you have roughly 50% of your population staying at home and not being productive. So there's a big difference between staying at home and working from home. So a lot of knowledge workers can work from home, so they are still productive. But roughly 50% of people in a hard lockdown situation stay at home and don't produce anything. What that implies is that we then typically lose about 30% of all production. So if you're thinking about GDP, in the Great Recession of 2008 to 2009, world GDP shrank by about 2%. And in the worst affected countries, GDP shrank by about 4 or 5%. So now you've got a situation where you induce a shrinkage of 30% in your GDP, roughly. So that's been my estimate. I see the Tony Blair Foundation has come out. They've done a lot of work on this and on how to get out of it, etc. And their work says that you lose about 25% of production. Estimates, but we lose a very large portion of production, between 25 and 35% of production gets lost. So this is a little bit akin to putting a patient into an induced coma. If you're a doctor and for certain conditions you induce a coma, your patient lies in bed, doesn't wake up, but just lies there. So this is a lot like that. You induce a coma for your economy. So the economy is still there, but it's actually inactive and not functioning fully. Now, the first thing that you would then do from an economic point of view is if you've got the patient in bed and he's lying there, you better put a glucose drip on fairly quickly, otherwise the patient will die of hunger. So if you go into lockdown, a lot of people lose their jobs and a lot of people don't have an income. And therefore, one of the first things you've got to do is you've got to make some kind of plan to feed those people who are at home. So you either need to give them food or you need to give them money. All the evidence is giving them money is much more effective than giving them food. So you have to find a way to give these people who are now staying at home without an income, you have got to start supplementing their income. If we can go to the graph of the jobless rate, that would be interesting. So one of the things that we've seen in the US is that one of the early statistics we get, to just get to what is the impact of this, in the US they monitor the new claims for unemployment in the economy. Thank you. You should be seeing a graph that looks like an inverted L, a little scribble at the bottom and then a massive rise. That is weekly claims for unemployment insurance. So we actually see that stat released every Thursday. So we'll see the new stat in tomorrow in the US. But essentially what you see there is that no more than 500,000 people in virtually any circumstances lose their jobs in one specific week and start claiming. So if you look at the top, roughly there in the mid 70s or in 2008, you see at the worst, you get about 500,000 new unemployed people. And then you literally see it going off the charts. So these charts have been produced later on. You would never actually use a chart with 7 million on your left-hand axis up to about a couple of weeks ago. But suddenly what we saw is in the first week after lockdown started in the US, and they don't have a strict general lockdown, but there is lockdown in many states. The first week we got 3 million unemployed. Then we got about
Wikus, can I just stop you there? Wikus, somebody's just joined us. If it's Neil, won't you just mute your speaker, please? Thanks, Wikus.
Okay. So welcome to everyone who's come from far away. So what we're seeing is that in about 4 weeks' time, we've had 22 million new unemployment claims in the US. So out of a workforce of about 165 million, about 15% have lost their jobs that we formally know of. So these are people who are formally employed by large businesses and are allowed to claim unemployment insurance. So it gives you an idea of the extent of the impact of this on the real economy. Now, what the US has done, we can move on from the graph, please. What the US has done is they have put in place a package of measures to provide relief. Now, again, it's called the stimulus package, but it's not really stimulus, because how do you stimulate your patient that's in an induced coma? You can't really. What it is disaster relief. So what you do is you start flowing money through to ordinary people and to businesses who need help. So large portions of this package is really money going to unemployment insurance. In the US, part of their package was to actually send a check of $1,200 to every adult American. If you can imagine something similar in South Africa, if we were to send a check to every adult South African, would that even work? Because no one would receive their checks because the post office is defunct in the first place. And in the second place, no one actually deals with checks anymore. People actually do electronic banking. So it seems a bit bizarre, but they actually posted a check with Donald Trump's signature on it. So he insisted on having his signature on every check that goes out, part of his political savvy, I guess. So putting money into the hands of ordinary people. And then also money towards businesses that are not operating and encouraging those businesses not to lay off their workers. So typically some of the money would go, if you don't fire your workers, you can get their payment, reclaim their payment from the government, parts of that. And part of it actually just aid for your business, because the next thing that happens is that everybody understands that once we're through this, we have to go back to normality, and you can't bankrupt all the businesses around you and think that you'll get back to a reasonable measure reasonably quickly. So in essence, you get the hard lockdown, you lose 30% of production, and you start relief measures. Now in South Africa, we did exactly the same. We had a hard lockdown fairly early. So we really haven't had a massive epidemic in South Africa, largely because we locked down early. And we actually have a president who is prepared to put on a face mask on TV, even though he's never practiced it before. In America, the vice president visits hospitals and refuses to put a face mask on. So in South Africa, at least, we have a sensible president who's prepared to put a face mask on. And then the second thing is we eventually then got a package of relief measures, which is a package that is roughly 10% of GDP. So in relative size, our relief package is roughly equivalent to the American relief package. The problem, obviously, we now face is how quickly will that money reach the hungry people? Because part of what we're seeing is we're already seeing a lot of protests around the place, and it's because people don't have income and they don't have food, and they then eventually come out in some form of protest. But so that's the general rule, is you have the hard lockdown with the relief package. Then when you get the virus under control, you have to go to some kind of next level of lockdown. So you can't keep people strictly locked down forever. So the first question becomes, what next? And the first answer is, the first question then is, when do we go back to normal? When are we past the whole virus thing? And the answer is, we can only get past the virus impact in one of three cases. So one of three things need to happen. The most anticipated thing is we get a vaccine, we vaccinate virtually the whole population, or at least all vulnerable people, and we can then get on with our normal lives. Now, the people who deal with vaccines on a regular basis are all actually quite pessimistic about how long it will take. The people who deal with all kinds of new science and new computers and so on say they can accelerate those processes, but it normally takes years to produce a new vaccine for a new virus. But the quickest we can anticipate, the head of Johnson & Johnson has come out and say they are in human trials with some vaccines already. If all goes well, the third stage trials will be complete by the end of the year, and we will have limited amounts of vaccine available roughly by March next year, and we'll have billions of dosages by mid next year. So do we get out of this with a vaccine? The earliest that would be realistic is somewhere in the first half of next year. We start seeing a vaccine, which means you've got to take measures to keep the virus under control for about another year. So that's a very long time in economics. The other possibility is that you don't contain the virus. The virus spreads through the population, somewhere between 60 and 80% gets infected, and then you get something called herd immunity, meaning so many people have already had it and is resistant to the virus that it stops spreading, and you can get on with your life with maybe a few incidents of local lockdowns from time to time because the virus hasn't been completely eradicated. So that's the second possibility. And Boris Johnson initially, before he got infected himself, by the way, he initially toyed with the idea of allowing the virus to spread through Britain and getting herd immunity into the community. As soon as they got a large number of infections and they started feeling pressure on the NHS, they also went for the hard lockdown. And I see Boris having returned from hospital. His first policy statement is we should not open up too quickly. This is extremely serious. So effectively, we've got very few places that have moved on from the hard lockdown yet, and we have no places where we've seen the virus spread to the extent that there is herd immunity. But if there was to be herd immunity, if you go to a country that cannot enforce a lockdown and you see the virus spread through that community, that probably takes 3 to 4 months. So the earliest you can come out with herd immunity is probably 4 to 6 months from the start of your epidemic. Then the last thing that may happen is we may have some kind of medicine that works on the worst affected patients. So if we have an antiviral medicine of some sort and it really works, that means we can bring the mortality rate down, which means that you can move on. So what actually happens now is that in countries like Singapore, like South Korea, like China, where they've brought the virus under control, they no longer have an epidemic, or in countries where they haven't had an epidemic yet, like New Zealand, we're now going to something that we would normally characterize as stage 2 of the lockdown. We've got various things. The Tony Blair Foundation have put out 3 levels of lockdown. In South Africa, we've announced 5 levels of lockdown, although we're all still in the first most stringent level of that lockdown. So there's all kinds of various things happening in terms of how strict the lockdown will be once you are past the epidemic. But the first thing that you do is you still forbid travel. So you don't allow any travel whatsoever in the next stage of lockdown. And you gradually allow people to start going back to work. And typically what you do is you allow people to go back who don't deal with the public. So you don't allow restaurants to open, you don't allow sporting events, those type of things. But factories where people can work far from each other, those type of things you allow to open. The problem with that is that people still have to get to work and from work, and if that transport is a minibus taxi, that's very difficult to distance yourself from other people in a normal South African minibus taxi. You know the old story. It's like there's always space for one more. So these things are known for being quite crowded, so very difficult to maintain social distancing in that circumstance. But still, that's typically what you do. In places like China, they have all kinds of sophisticated measures. So they have telephone apps that track where you go. And you are forced, if you want to move around, you have to sign on to that app. That app tracks your movements. It tracks the movements of everybody with that app. And if one of the people with that app then tests positive, they can tell whether you've been in contact with that person. And your phone will go from a green to a red and some shades of orange in between, depending on how your movements have intersected with the movements of people with the virus. In order to do all of these things, you also need a huge amount of testing. So one of the biggest problems in this whole thing has been that some countries seem to have gotten the testing thing right. So a place like South Korea virtually immediately started doing a huge amount of tests, a huge number, and that actually enabled them to get a hold on where the virus has spread to and how to contain the virus. In the English-speaking countries, we seem to have quite a bit of problems with testing. So the amount of testing going on in Britain is still very controversial. The amount of testing going on in the United States is still very controversial. But it's really very difficult to get into a next, more intelligent stage of the lockdown. without proper testing. But our estimate from an economic point of view is you go to a next stage, we allow more economic activity, but you still lose about 10% of GDP. So you go from a stage where you lose about 30% of GDP, with about half of your workers idle at home, to a situation where you have roughly 20% of your workers idle at home, and you lose about 10% of GDP. And then we would think that there would be, people will find clever ways to extend the working population. So we think that that 10% of GDP that you lose will gradually shrink to 5% as people become cleverer about their lockdowns and they have more testing and more apps allowing movement of people. You also may be able to test for antibodies and allow people who have already been infected to start with more economic activity. So there may be clever things to do, and we'll chat about those clever things in the second stage. But for the moment, we know that we go into a prolonged period of GDP being 10% lower than normal. Now, again, 10% lower than normal is absolutely unprecedented. We haven't seen that at all for at least 100 years. So from an economic point of view, this is a complete disaster. It's unlike anything we've seen before. And what happens to the economy, unfortunately, is lots of speculation about what happens after the lockdown. And there's a lot of speculation about what is called a V-shaped recovery, meaning that you get a rapid slowing of the economy, and then once the lockdown is passed, you just switch the lights on again, and you get a very rapid recovery. So that's the V-shaped recovery in the economy. We don't see that at all, because we think that in the period that you're in a lockdown, things actually continue to happen. And the main economic thing that happens is that people still keep on spending money, but they don't have income. So if you think about the three actors in the economy, the first actor are consumers. And what happens is that roughly 25% of consumers are unaffected, and they may in fact be spending less than normal. So they actually they get normal income, but they don't have normal spending patterns. So they've got a little bit of excess money that they would like to spend at the end of the lockdown. So that might contribute to a V-shaped recovery. But then you have about 50% of people who are negatively affected. So they have to stay home, and or they are on slow pay. So there's many companies that have cut pay for their employees to 80% or 70% or 50% of what they would normally receive. Or you get those people who get unemployment insurance, but they actually can't cope with the unemployment insurance. It doesn't cover their normal expenses. So for 50% of people, their balance sheet comes under pressure. So they use their credit cards and whatever credit facilities they have to stay alive, and they use whatever cash they've got to stay alive. But eventually, their balance sheets are going backwards. And when they can go back to work and start earning money again, their level of confidence to spend will be extremely low, and their desire to replenish their savings will be very high. Meaning they will come out and they will be very keen to produce, but they will not be very keen to spend. So that is called a low level of consumer confidence. And then you have about 25% of people who have no income, who are dependent on alms and food package distribution, and relatives who are who get grants for income. Those people's balance sheets are devastated. They will also want to come back, but they will find it very hard to find jobs, so they will stay unemployed and for a while, but once they get employment, they will try to save as much as they can. So in essence, there's very little doubt that when we get out on the other side of this, there will be a very low level of consumer confidence worldwide, and there will be a severe lack of spending. Now, this comes on top of a situation where we already have an aging population globally, and that aging population is already reluctant to spend because they're saving for their eventual retirement. So that situation gets compounded. So that's the one actor in the economy. The other actor in the economy are companies, and again, the same spread. Some companies doing well, Zoom, etc. A lot of companies, though, are affected in some way, and their balance sheets are going backwards. They are still paying rent, they're paying some employees and so on, but they are using up their credit facilities, they're using up their cash, and when they get back to normality, they will be very, very reluctant to make new investments. They will try to rebuild their balance sheets first. And then you have about 25% of companies who are going bankrupt unless they get bailed out by government. And again, we know that in China, in March alone, 460,000 businesses failed. So a lot of businesses are in the process of failing. So some capacity is getting destroyed, but that capacity which remains on the whole will be very reluctant to invest. That's normally called a lack of business confidence. So business confidence levels will be extremely low worldwide when we come out of this. And then you get to the third actor, governments. So governments are now spending very large amounts of money on disaster relief. And then when we get through the crisis, they will have to try to stimulate the economy, but they will have built up a large amount of debt in the meantime. So they will be reluctant to stimulate too much because of the fact that their balance sheets are under pressure. So effectively, lack of capacity of governments to stimulate the economy, very low business confidence, and very low consumer confidence. That's the very definition of a very deep recession or even a depression. So we don't actually see a V-shaped recovery at all. We think it looks a lot more like maybe a W, or some people are even talking about an L, meaning you get the fall and then it's flat after that. You don't actually get much of a recovery. We think there will be a recovery, but the recovery will be weak once we get through this. What we do think is that there will be a lot more government involvement in the economy. The history of disasters is governments come to the rescue, and then they never really retreat from the economy after that. Which brings me to the last subject, which is markets. And I'll say more about markets in our update section. But the long and the short of it is markets have not been very rational in dealing with this issue. And I think that it's because you get this thing happening in the wrong way around. So what I normally say to people is this is an Alice in Wonderland situation. You go down the rabbit hole and everything is upside down. So things that would normally, everything is the opposite of what it would normally be. And what normally happens in crisis is that there's some problem in the financial or credit system, and that eventually spills over into the real economy, and that causes a recession. And then you get stock markets going down somewhere between 25 and 60%. In this case, the problem arose in the real economy because people are being told to stay home and businesses are being told to shut down. So it's not something that originated in the financial markets. So financial markets are really struggling to get to grips with this. So what we saw is, first of all, the stock market was quite slow to respond. In fact, other measures, bond markets and the gold market and so on, responded much more quickly. First of all, in a positive way. But eventually, by mid-March, it became clear that this is actually something very serious for the economy. And we got a very strong downdraft in the stock markets. So stock markets from top to bottom went down about 35%. So that is what you would normally get for a normal recession, roughly. And then what happened is that there was a lot of announcements about aid from the Federal Reserve in the US and from the European Central Bank in Europe, and large aid packages being announced. And markets actually started recovering. So we're currently only down about 15% from the top. And that seems very unlikely to be adequate to deal with the kind of recession we see even once the crisis is past. So in essence, fund managers are interpreting this as a V-shaped event for markets. The markets go down initially at the scare, but they soon enough see that the governments are on top of this. They're putting enough stimulus in, and the recovery will be quick. Also, we won't stay in the lockdown for too long. So in 3 or 4 months' time, we'll be back to normal, and the economy will be functioning as normal, and the stock market will go back to where it was. So we have a serious difference of opinion with stock markets. So from our point of view, we've moved all our clients into cash. We are recommending to new clients to move into cash, because we think that eventually when the size and of the problems become apparent, the stock market will go down roughly 60% from its top in order to give a proper reflection of the trouble in the real economy. So that would be roughly equal to what happened in the credit crunch of 2008-09. In that case, we saw a bear market that lasted about a year, and the stock market from top to bottom went down about 60%. So we think that's roughly what needs to happen. We also think that the amount of stimulus being put into economies at this point is way inadequate to return the economies to health. So what we've seen in America, for instance, is about a $2.5 trillion stimulus. That is just disaster relief that will keep the patient alive. In order to get back to normality, they probably need at least another $5 trillion of stimulus over the next 3 years in order to get the economy back to proper health. And large parts of that are likely to be infrastructure projects. So from our point of view, we think that this is disastrous from an economic point of view. We think it should be disastrous from a market point of view, but we haven't seen that in markets. So we think that there's an opportunity to get out of markets. We think there will be a fantastic opportunity in about 6 months to a year's time to get back into markets at much lower levels. And then when the economy starts gradually recovering over a 5-year period from 2021 into 2026, we'll see a very strong bull market again, roughly looking like the bull market between 2009 and 2014. So we think that it's not a disaster for our clients. Our clients are coming through this without too many problems. But it is something that markets will still have to internalize.